In February 1969, David Lurie needed the help of a psychiatrist because David was hearing voices. He managed to speak to a psychiatrist at Haverford State Hospital in Pennsylvania, where he described the voices as saying things like hollow, empty, and thud. After an in-depth interview, the psychiatrist concluded that David should be admitted to hospital with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Problem was, David was making that up. He wasn't hearing voices at all. And a probably much bigger problem, David Lurie, he didn't exist. To help us unpack that, we'll access some articles' links in the description. This one here is probably good for an overview. Title is Rosenhan, 1973 Experiment on Being Sane in Insane Places. Between 1969 and 1972, Professor David Rosenhan, a psychiatrist at Stanford Uni, sent 8 pseudo patients to 12 psychiatric hospitals without revealing this to the staff. None of the pseudo patients had any symptoms or history of mental disorders. In all 12 instances, pseudo patients were diagnosed with a mental disorder and hospitalized. In no instance was the misdiagnosis discovered during hospitalization. In some of the 12 hospital stays, pseudo patients observed significant deficits in patient-staff contact. And David Rosenhan is quoted from 1973 as writing, "At its heart, the question of whether the sane can be distinguished from the insane and whether degrees of insanity can be distinguished from each other is a simple matter. Do the salient characteristics that lead to diagnoses reside in the patients themselves or in the environments and contexts in which observers find them?" I think that's actually a very powerful question to ask, because context and environment can make a big difference to interpretation. Then the article goes on. The recent publication of the APA, that's the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-2, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, number 2. We're on number 5 now, by the way, so this is 1968 they're referring to, underscored the popular belief among practitioners that psychiatric conditions could be distinguished from each other and from normal psychiatric good health, much like physiological diseases can be distinguished from each other and from good health itself. In the 1960s, an increasing number of critiques of this belief emerged, arguing that psychiatric diagnoses were not as objective, valid, or substantive as their physiological counterparts, but were rather more like opinions, and therefore subject to implicit biases, even when propounded by competent psychiatrists or psychologists. And that, I think, certainly in the 60s, was a fair argument to make. And then we get a little bit about the study itself. 9 participants, including Professor Rosenhan, were recruited. All were deemed to have no present or past symptoms of serious psychiatric disorders. Each gained admission to one of 9 district hospitals. In 8 cases, admittance was gained without the hospital staff's foreknowledge. In Professor Rosenhan's case, the hospital administrator and chief psychologist knew of their hospital's inclusion in the study. Data from Professor Rosenhan's stay or stays were not excluded from the study. And again, from the same article, just to focus on this little bit here, it seemed that once diagnosed with an aberrant psychiatric trait, participants were unable to escape the diagnosis, despite their having dropped the farce immediately upon admission. Again, I'm not sure whether that is that surprising, because depending on what the psychological issue is, then people can, let's say, become agitated and then can become calm. And it would be unlikely that staff in such an establishment would go, oh, would have been okay for a couple of days, all is well. They would want to observe them. However, this is also a problem. The admission diagnoses seemed, in Professor Rosenhan's words, so powerful that many of the participants' normal behaviours were overlooked entirely or profoundly misinterpreted. Again, that is a fair point. There's no doubt that we can look at somebody in, let's say, a sporting arena who may be doing a warm-up and are a singer, practicing doing vocal work. And if someone is doing the same thing on a pavement in the middle of a high street, it can look a little bit odd, or certainly more odd than it would in context of the sporting arena or behind the scenes of an opera as someone warms a voice up. Anyway, Professor Rosenhan offered the following explanation for this surprising result. Persons not diagnosed with a mental illness nonetheless at times exhibit aberrant behaviour, like pacing around or frequently writing. Without a psychopathic diagnosis, these behaviours are attributed to something other than psychopathy, like being bored or being a writer. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And so it's a very profound point that he makes here. And also, I should point out that when it is said psychopathic here and psychopathy, this is not referring to specifically a psychopath. This is really saying that there is a pathology of the psyche, of the psychology, of the mental condition, the psychological state of an individual. So it's not specifically about a psychopath. These words are used these days often when talking about a psychopath. The fact that such behaviours are often attributed to psychopathies in diagnosed patients, Professor Rosenhan argued, points more to the enormous overlap in behaviours of the sane and the insane than to the competence of psychiatrists, psychologists or nurses. I agree. Couldn't agree more. There's a huge overlap, gigantic, and we're all influenced by the labels that people have been given, that we give them, that are given to us, and environments, contexts, situations. Not ideal though, is it? And then we're going to go here. I'm just going to read just pretty much this one page, this front page from the New Scientist to introduce someone. The title of this is The Flawed Experiment That Destroyed the World's Faith in Psychiatry. Hold on, wait a minute. The flawed experiment? The flawed experiment that destroyed the world's faith in psychiatry. What are you saying? What's this person saying here? Well, 50 years ago, when the article was written, 2020, psychiatrist David Rosenhan went undercover in a psychiatric hospital to expose its dark side. But his shocking findings aren't what they seem, reveals Susanna Cahalan. And you go, oh, really? We need to find out more. Again, for the sake of keeping the video relatively short and pithy, I think there's a very succinct description. It still goes into some detail in another article, which we will access here, where someone's writing about Susanna's work. And this is from the Financial Times, and the author is Anjana Ahuja. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. The title of the article is A Great Pretender, Undercover Experiment That Shook Psychiatry. So, again, a bit of a preamble. I'm not reading all the article. As with any of them, I encourage you to read the ones, particularly the ones that you find interesting, because there'll be more detail in them than I'm going to go over here. Anyway, Rosenhan described how he and 7 sane pseudonymous, which I think means people who are using pseudonyms, pseudonymous accomplices faked hearing voices in their heads in order to get admitted, to document how they would be treated, and crucially, how long it would take to be rumbled. That if you don't know what that colloquialism, but it's a bit of a colloquialism, means found out. How long it would take to be found out. His results, published in a prestigious science journal in 1973, were sensational. Not one stooge or pseudo-patient was unmasked with some needing legal help to spring free. What? Wow. Fellow patients were wilier than staff at spotting the charade. We now know that we cannot distinguish insanity from sanity, Rosenhan concluded. I don't think that's strictly true. It's true. I don't think we can say that's a global statement. His analysis lobbed an exquisitely timed grenade into the heart of psychiatry, explains Susanna Cahalan in The Great Pretender. That's the book that Susanna has written. It was a field then under public fire for brutal practices such as prolonged incarceration, electroshock therapy, and lobotomy. The artful deception earned Rosenhan fame and admiration and triggered decades of soul-searching among the very professionals tasked with healing the souls of others. How could psychiatrists mend broken minds if they couldn't even identify them? Susanna thought that Rosenhan's work would be great as a subject for her next book. So she researched him. However, the deeper she dug into his archive, the more unsettled she became. She tried tracing Rosenhan's 7 pseudo-patients, but uncovered only one. Bill Underwood signed up after becoming captivated by Rosenhan's lectures on psychopathology. He went on to become a psychology professor. When you talked to David, you felt like you were the most important person in the world. Underwood never dreamt he would be admitted. He spent 9 days inside and recalls leaving off his own account. Okay, so he didn't seem to need any legal help to get out. She also tracked down another credible participant, Harry Lando, who enrolled in the same Stanford psychopathology class. His positive experience was excluded from Rosenhan's analysis, something that today looks suspiciously like cherry-picking data. Lando, who also became a psychology professor, outed himself as the 9th pseudo-patient in 1976 to set the record straight. But the short paper in a middling journal received little fanfare. So basically, it looks like his experience wasn't really, he didn't register with anyone or hardly anyone. But he had a positive experience, which kind of went against the narrative. Rosenhan himself, who never divulged the real names of his accomplices or the hospitals they infiltrated, except for his own, went incognito as David Lurie. In case you hadn't guessed, that's who David Lurie was. It was Rosenhan himself. But his published account of that time, such as reasons for discharge, differed from his hospital's medical records. And Cahalan also found the unfinished manuscript of a book that had earned him a huge advance from Doubleday, publisher, even though it was guaranteed to be a bestseller in the vein of Ken Casey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He never submitted it. Doubleday eventually sued him. Why, after his greatest academic triumph, did Rosenhan retreat into obscurity? And Cahalan's exasperation with the investigative dead ends, particularly on the identities of Rosenhan's faux mad accomplices, leaps off the page. Why did every one of my leads go nowhere, she writes. Why had Rosenhan so obscured the path to these pseudo-patients? Had I spent my time pursuing phantoms in a fictional universe? She accurately conveys the troubles that have haunted psychiatry over the past half-century, embodied by Rosenhan's famous critique as it struggled to transform itself into an objective science. She interrogates important academics from that time, such as Alan Francis. Her book, which I hope wins awards, has immense value as a historical account. And sort of in conclusion, as to whether the central protagonist was a fraud, this is the author of the Financial Times article, like Callahan, find it incredible that not a single pseudo patient from that 1973 study has materialised unbidden to tell their extraordinary story of being a sane person in an insane place. At least 5 remain unknown to this day, if they ever existed. That, then, is the complicated legacy of David Rosenhan, a celebrated psychologist who might have been a greater pretender than anyone realised. What do you think? Was he making it up? Was he making some of it up? The stuff that he made up, if you think he did make it up, was it, however, perhaps a pastiche? Was it actually similar to what was going on? Could it have been that Rosenhan had decided to get a bit of information, some research, but embellish it because he had seen things go wrong for so many years, and almost wrote a kind of novelization of the research because he knew what he wanted to say, and he knew he had to lob this well-timed device which was going to blow up in a few people's faces. He had to lob it at that time because things really needed to be challenged. Was that ethical? Well, the research wasn't ethical. I mean, people didn't know that there were patients who weren't patients. They were essentially acting. That certainly wasn't ethical. And it's a tiny study. It is statistically hugely underpowered. There's a lot of flaws, and maybe some of it not true. But it got people talking. So maybe it was worthwhile. But again, what do you think?